The authors are in front of you: George Terzis, who is an associate professor and researcher at the Free Universiteit in Brussels, Vesalius College, and he's an expert in Global Governance Institute. He is the founding chair of the Journalist Studies section at European Communication Research and Education Association. His research focuses on media and security governance, European media governance, public diplomacy, foreign correspondence, and the development of pan-European media. He had been also a journalist before finishing his PhD. He was a journalist who worked in the EU and NATO correspondent for the Greek media. And he was also course leader for the European Journalist Center. He was training journalists for different countries. In fact, we shared some famous evenings at NATO during the terrible Kosovo days. And he's one of the two curators of this book, Foreign Correspondents in Europe. Gareth is also another colleague, is now managing director of Clear Europe, and he's a head of the Missouri School of Journalism in Brussels. He also is a former journalist, has been a speechwriter, and also was a trainer for the European Journalist Center. So we have been, there's been many occasions in which we have been sharing experience and doing things together. I just leave the floor to you because I presume there will be a lot of questions from the floor. So I don't want to waste time with my words. Just welcome from the press club and from journalists at your service, which I also represent.
Teach you everything you need to know about politics and media. There's an episode in there called "In Brussels No One Hears You Scream," and one of the journalists goes up to her editor and says, "I've got a great story about a European commissioner, a new European commissioner." He goes, "That's boring. No one's interested in Brussels. Give me something sexy." And I think there is that. There's that. I would like to say myth that Brussels is boring, that it's impossible to make it interesting. I think there are ways. I'm not quite sure, when Politico launched, that we can turn it into a movie. But I still think there are ways of making it interesting. I'd be happy to talk about that. That's it from me. We're happy to take questions. Go ahead, if anyone wants. If you want to get in touch, it's Gareth Harding at mac.com or at Gareth Harding on Twitter. And as I said, we'll be pouring out a lot of this information in different forms over the next couple of days. If I could talk about the quality of Brussels reporting without dissing too much on my colleagues, I think we'll all agree that there's too much recycling of information and regurgitating of press releases with the obligatory he said, she said comments from a couple of think tanks or trade associations. It was something which I did as well. One of the reasons I actually left day-to-day journalism was I kind of felt sick of constantly actually doing what I thought was bad reporting, which was just going along to the Commission, picking up the press releases, reporting what they said and then getting a few others. And it kind of felt a little bit like, stuffing yourself on McDonald's burgers. And you felt you were filled but not fulfilled as a journalist. And so I see a room certainly for longer pieces, more analytical pieces explaining actually what this means and how it's going to affect things and how it's going to affect people, rather than obsessing about the process, which I think still journalists tend to get a little bit caught up in that process. It can be done. I am a huge admirer of Spiegel's, not Peter, but him as well, but Der Spiegel International, I think, is gold standard journalism, because it manages to be colourful and witty and with muscular prose and great quotes and superb interviews. So I'd like to see a bit more innovation as well. That it doesn't have to be just standard blocks of text or pictures of people getting in and out of cars as they arrive at summits. I think we could mess up with multimedia a lot more. There's very little innovative work being done with multimedia in this town. I'd like to see more of that. Funnily enough, I'd love to see BuzzFeed come here and shake things up a little bit. And I'm sure they will, since they seem to be the biggest growing news organisation probably on the planet at the moment.
A question here.
Sorry, I'm curious to know what kind of criteria you use to determine if someone is a foreign correspondent. Because here in Brussels it's clear, you have to be accredited to the institutions or to the Belgian government. You have to be, in order to be accredited, you have to be a full-time professional journalist. I know from experience there are many foreign correspondents that do their job on the side. They have another job, only 20-30% of the time they spend as journalists, and they have other business to do. Do you consider them foreign correspondents in their own right, and did they count as much as all the other foreign correspondents in your research, or what criteria? What is a foreign correspondent in your opinion?
Yeah, actually, in literature there are a lot of definitions, 4 or 5 different definitions. But for the sake of our research, we only use the numbers from registered correspondents. Whatever registration different countries use. Some use the Foreign Affairs Ministry, some they use the national press clubs, etc.
But many countries that don't have any registration.
Yeah. No, I mean in every country, if you want to attend the ministries, whatever press conference or whatever, you have to have some kind of registration. So we use that, and that's why we said that there is a margin of error. And in some countries, this margin of error is bigger than the other. But we had to use, a certain kind of definition, and we chose to do this. But there are many definitions, of course. I mean, there are corporations who have foreign correspondents now. Big corporations use foreign correspondents, self-employed foreign correspondents themselves. Lobbies have foreign correspondents. So, but we use only the registered correspondents.
Just in Brussels terms, as I tried to make clear, I was talking about EU-accredited journalists, not necessarily correspondents. So I think if you're a local hire for a local firm, I'm thinking, you reporter or you politics or MLEX, or Euractiv or any of those, are you a correspondent in the traditional sense of the term? Probably not. There are others, like you mentioned, who are doing many other things, especially some of the younger journalists, and I don't blame them. I did a fair bit of that as well, chairing conferences and writing reports for different people. I think it's easy to criticize when you're a full-time correspondent with your kids in the international school and costing your organization $200,000 a year. But when you're a struggling young freelance, like a lot of my students, former students are, like I was once, you have to do other things, just like, if you're trying to make it in Hollywood, you're probably going to do a bit of waiting at some point, waiting tables. If you're trying to be a journalist now, you're probably going to have to do a little bit of teaching English or French or, doing some copy editing and other stuff.
Yeah, good morning, Gareth. Do you know if the Brussels Press Corps is underpaid, reflecting the revenue model of the media today?
We didn't look into how much they're paid. A lot of correspondents here are correspondents on nice deals and traditional. I mean, that way is that way of sending people on 4-year stints in different places, and as I said, sending their kids to international schools, paying for their house and their cars. That model clearly is going the way of the dinosaurs. There are less and less correspondents employed like that. More people are using local hires, or they're parachuting journalists in for big stories, clearly. So I would probably say that, yeah, a lot of the journalists on that scale of things, the correspondents, are decently paid. And there's a lot of journalists who are struggling. But in terms of the median salary for journalists, I don't think anyone's got figures on that, certainly in Brussels terms.
Yes, just one question. I mean, a few months ago, the former executive director at Washington Post published a report for the Committee of Journalists on the relation between the White House press corps and the U.S. administration, and he described this relation as very bad, with persecution of leakers, with more secrecy, with a number of initiatives against the press. How would you characterize the relations between the Brussels press corps and the EU institutions? They seem to be very nice, and does it mean that there's not much watchdog journalism, not enough watchdog journalism in here? Or just because, as you said, the EU is very much an open institution? Is it really the explanation of the fact that the relation seems to be quite cozy between the press corps and the EU institutions?
As I said, I think certainly in the 70s and 80s, early 90s perhaps, it was incredibly reverential. And all the journalists who I've spoken to, I mean even older than I am, have confirmed that fact. I think it's definitely got more critical since then, and that sort of cozy, almost incestuous relationship between journalists and some spokespeople is slightly more tetchy, slightly more fraught, as perhaps the Commission as well has become more political, and as public opinion has got more lukewarm towards the EU in most countries. So the journalists who are here kind of reflecting that as well. But I still think that it's we often inhabit the same worlds, and I include myself in this with a sunken feeling that there is quite we're all part of the Brussels bubble, really. You know, the journalists and the spokespeople and the Commission officials and the lobbyists and the think tankers, you know, go to the same parties and cocktails and drinks, and they're often married to each other or living together. So yeah, I think there's a bit too cozy relationship. I think it's really important to keep a distance, to maybe smoke but not inhale, as Clinton said.
Gareth, you mentioned the habit of spoon-feeding journalists by the European Commission. Do you think that we would have a healthier, independent press corps here if the European Commission's communication budget was slashed, thereby enabling independent publications and freelancers to earn an honest crust?
No. No, I don't think it'd make that much difference, actually. I mean, journalists would still they'd go elsewhere for their main source of stories. Maybe they'd concentrate a little bit more on Parliament and the Council. But I actually don't think it'd make that much difference in terms of quality. Okay, we're free to have a little chat. I know a couple of people want to interview us, but hang around and grab a coffee with us. And thanks all for coming.